went dead as a doornail for lying to the Holy Spirit. That was the first trouble in the early church. His wife came in. Peter did the same rigmarole with her. Over she went, dead as a doornail for lying to the Holy Spirit. I don't recommend it. But chapter 6 has some more trouble. What we see in chapter 6 is that the number of disciples was increasing, so this was starting to just be a more complex organization. And Greek-speaking believers were becoming embittered at Hebrew-speaking believers because the Greek speakers thought that their widows were not getting the same share of the food distribution as the widows of the Hebrew speakers. Again, this was a commune, so these older women relied on the church to provide their meals. The 12 apostles, the church leadership, nipped that trouble in the bud by appointing this board of administrators called deacons, we learn later. And in fact, in the reading from Philippians, Orlando talked about deacons and overseers. These were basically administrators for, again, the non-spiritual business of the church. Among those appointed was Stephen. His name means crowned. And Acts chapter 6, verse 5 says he was full of faith and of the Holy Spirit. Verse 8 of that chapter said he was full of grace and of God's power. And he did great wonders and miracles among the people. There was something pretty special about Stephen. Another thing that we can very clearly see in the book of Acts, the early church was entirely 100% Jewish. They still went to the synagogue and kept their customs. And we can see if we look in Acts chapter 3, for example, Peter and John went together to the temple at the prescribed hour for prayer. Not before, not after, exactly when they were supposed to go. It was the 9th hour, 3 o'clock in the afternoon. The difference between these believing Jews, of course, and other Jews, is that they'd accepted the revelation that Jesus is the Messiah, the only way to peace with God the Father. And importantly, in Acts chapter 2, we see they had experienced a phenomenal outpouring of the Holy Spirit that brought with it supernatural, God-given power. And that's how Stephen, this new deacon, was able to perform these wonders and signs. But they were still engaging in Jewish sacramental life. That's the point. They were still hanging out with Jews who had not accepted Christ. Non-believing Jews weren't happy about what they no doubt saw as a heresy, especially when, as we can see in chapter 6, verse 7, a great many of their own priests were converting to the faith. Remember, if you were here last week, I told you one of the sins that carried the death penalty in the Mosaic Law is blasphemy. That's contemptuous speech directed at God. So in Acts chapter 6, we can read that Stephen was engaging with these non-believing Jews, and because he was a gifted speaker and filled with the Holy Spirit and resultant power, verse 10 said these others could not withstand the wisdom and the spirit with which he spake. Spoke. There's my King James coming out of my DNA. Since they couldn't win the argument the fair way, they secretly instigated an investigation of Stephen. They arrested him and brought him before the Sanhedrin, which was the ruling council of the Jewish people, and they accused him of blasphemy, which carries with it the penalty of stoning, a stoning death. Verse 15 of Acts chapter 6 says that when he had been brought before the council, the Sanhedrin, all of the members of the council looked at him, and it seemed as though he had the face of an angel. Now, chapter 7, from which Orlando read, begins with the high priest asking Stephen, are these things so? Are these accusations? Are they true? Stephen then launches into an impassioned sermon that lasts from John chapter 7, verse 2 until John chapter 7, verse 53. A long sermon, and it ends with this peroration. You stiff-necked people, your hearts and ears are still uncircumcised. You are just like your ancestors. You always resist the Holy Spirit. Was there ever a prophet your ancestors did not persecute? They even killed those who predicted the coming of the righteous one. And now you have betrayed and murdered him, you who have received the law that was given through angels, but have not obeyed it. That was too much for the council, and we heard from